Welcome to episode 11, part 3 of our ongoing series on power politics here on Diplomacy and Discourse channel. In our last two episodes, we tracked the evolution of power from ancient empires and medieval monarchs to the world wars and Cold War superpowers, and finally into the post-Cold War landscape shaped by globalization, diplomacy, and resurgent nationalism. Now in part 3, we step into the present. Today's world may be more interconnected, but it's also more volatile, with regional conflicts revealing just how alive and dangerous power politics remains. We will begin with Ukraine, where Russia's invasion has shattered assumptions about European security and exposed the limits of deterrence. Then, we'll turn to the South China Sea, where China's expansionism and U.S. naval strategy reflect a high-stakes power contest in the Indo-Pacific. And finally, we'll examine the Middle East, where Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel each pursue dominance through shifting alliances, proxy warfare, and energy diplomacy. These aren't just isolated crises. They are battlegrounds for global influence. Russia's latest moves underscores its commitment to maintaining and expanding its regional influence, especially in response to NATO's growth. The war in Ukraine is still a major priority. Russia wants international recognition of the territories it's taken, like Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine, and uses arguments about protecting Russian-speaking communities to justify its presence. The Kremlin continues to present this as a matter of national security rather than aggression, painting itself as reacting to NATO's advance rather than initiating conflict. Its concern over NATO expansion has only grown, especially now that Finland and Sweden have officially joined the alliance. To counter this, Russia has been increasing its military buildup along its western border, especially near Finland. Satellite images show new bases and installations going up, which experts see as preparation to reinforce Russia's posture in the region, should tensions escalate. Meanwhile, the Arctic is becoming another stage for power politics. As melting ice opens up new trade routes and resource opportunities, Russia is boosting its surveillance and deploying drones to claim its share of influence. This move hasn't gone unnoticed. NATO countries are stepping up their own Arctic operations, signaling the beginning of a new strategic race in the far north. Russia justifies its broader foreign policy by leaning on the idea of historical ties. It claims that former Soviet states and regions with ethnic Russians fall naturally within its sphere of influence. So when these neighbors move toward NATO or the EU, the Kremlin sees it as a provocation. That's how it justifies military action, election interference, and energy coercion, presenting them as defensive tactics against Western encroachment. At the heart of it, Russia's playbook is a mix of old-school hard power and modern hybrid tactics. It uses everything from tanks to cyber attacks to keep its neighbors within reach and to push back against what it sees as a US-led world order. The United States has consistently used diplomatic, economic sanctions, and strategic alliances to maintain its global role and influence. This mix of tools is designed to enforce international norms, protect US interests, and respond to global instability without always resorting to military force. A clear example is the US response to Belarus in 2020. After President Lukashenko's widely contested re-election and violent crackdowns on protesters, the US quickly sanctioned top Belarusian officials. These included asset freezes and travel bans aimed at signaling that human rights violations would not be tolerated. That kind of quick, targeted economic pressure is a signature part of the US foreign policy toolbox. But this approach hasn't been evenly applied, and many countries have called out the US for double standards, especially regarding Israel. Despite credible reports from organizations and media outlets alleging that certain Israeli military units have committed human rights violations against Palestinians, the Biden administration stopped short of imposing any sanctions. Even after acknowledging those concerns, it chose not to penalize the Israeli units, likely due to long-standing political, military, and strategic ties between the two countries. This has sparked frustration across the Middle East and among human rights observers, who argue that such selective enforcement undercuts U.S. credibility. This kind of inconsistency feeds the broader narrative that U.S. foreign policy is often shaped more by strategic interests than by a principled defense of human rights. Many countries see it as the U.S. shielding allies from consequences while swiftly punishing adversaries. Beyond sanctions, the U.S. also uses military presence and foreign aid to reinforce its influence, especially in regions where Russia is active. Providing security assistance to countries bordering Russia, coordinating sanctions with NATO and EU partners, and investing in local development efforts are all part of this playbook. These moves are intended not just to deter aggression, but also to prevent rival powers from gaining a stronger foothold. Many countries see it as the U.S. shielding allies from consequences while swiftly punishing allies. Beyond sanctions, the U.S. also uses military presence and foreign aid to reinforce its influence, especially in regions where Russia is active. Providing security assistance to countries bordering Russia, coordinating sanctions with NATO and EU partners, and investing in local development efforts are all part of this playbook. These moves are intended not just to deter aggression, but to prevent rival powers from gaining a stronger foothold. Still, whether these tools actually produce the intended outcomes, lasting stability, economic reforms, or deterrence, remains up for debate. Critics argue that inconsistent application undermines trust and that sanctions alone often don't change a regime's behavior. But the U.S. continues to rely on them because they remain a low-cost, high-visibility way to project power without deploying troops. The return of spheres of influence as a geopolitical concept has stirred intense debate in the wake of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The idea that powerful states are entitled to control or heavily influence their neighbors to preserve strategic interests was largely considered outdated after the Cold War. But Russia's behavior, framed by its leaders as a defensive response to NATO's eastward expansion, has revived the theory with alarming consequences. By attacking Ukraine, Russia effectively signaled that it sees its near abroad as a zone of influence that must remain under Moscow's sway. This has shattered assumptions in the West that sovereignty and territorial integrity are settled norms. Instead, Russia's strategy invokes a 19th and early 20th century mindset of great power privilege, where influence is asserted through coercion and proximity rather than diplomacy and law. The international community, particularly NATO and the EU, has pushed back hard against this logic. Their military support for Ukraine, sanctions on Moscow, and renewed defense commitments to Eastern NATO members are not just acts of solidarity. They are meant to reaffirm that borders cannot be changed by force. These moves represent an effort to defend the liberal international order, where states, regardless of size, have the right to chart their own paths free from external domination. That said, the discourse is more nuanced than just rejection. Some realists argue that ignoring Russia's sense of strategic vulnerability, especially regarding Ukraine and NATO, was short-sighted. But even among those circles, few defend spheres of influence as a justifiable principle in the 21st century. The widespread consensus remains that accepting such a model would destabilize global order and legitimize the behavior of authoritarian powers seeking to rewrite the rules. The war in Ukraine has therefore become more than a regional conflict. It is a test case for whether the post-1945 international system, based on sovereignty and legal norms, can survive in the face of revisionist powers. Whether or not the West can uphold these principles, without sliding into open great power conflict, will shape the global order for decades to come. Former U.S. President Joe Biden's approach to the Ukraine conflict has been widely recognized for its emphasis on diplomacy, international cooperation, and support for democratic institutions. His administration's strategy involved rallying a broad coalition of allies to impose sanctions on Russia, providing substantial military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, and reinforcing NATO's eastern flank. This multilateral response was seen as a significant achievement in U.S. foreign policy, aiming to uphold international norms and deter further aggression. In contrast, President Donald Trump's foreign policy was characterized by a more unilateral America First approach. While he did impose sanctions on Russia and provide military aid to Ukraine, his administration often sent mixed signals regarding U.S. commitment to allies and international agreements. Trump's rhetoric sometimes appeared sympathetic to Russian perspective, leading to concerns among European partners about the reliability of U.S. support. Had Trump's policies been in place during the escalation of the Ukraine conflict, analysts suggest that the lack of a cohesive and coordinated international response might have emboldened further aggression, potentially leading to a more severe crisis. The Biden administration's focus on alliance building and collective action has been credited with strengthening the international community's ability to respond effectively to the situation. In summary, Biden's handling of the Ukraine conflict underscored the importance of diplomatic engagement and multilateral cooperation in addressing global security challenges, contrasting with the more isolationist tendencies observed during Trump's first tenure. The United States is actively using power politics in the South China Sea to push back against China's growing maritime ambitions. Rather than relying on one approach, the U.S. combines hard power, strategic partnerships, and diplomacy to shape the balance of power in the region. Freedom of Navigation Operations, FONOP, are a cornerstone of this strategy. These missions are more than symbolic. They are legal challenges to China's sweeping territorial claims. When the USS Preble sailed near the Spratly Islands in December 2024, it wasn't just about presence. It was about reinforcing that international waters can't be turned into exclusive zones by force. These operations send a direct message that the U.S. won't recognize China's attempt to redraw maritime boundaries. The U.S. has also deepened military cooperation with countries that share concerns over China's assertiveness. Exercises like Balikatan with the Philippines and trilateral naval drills with Japan and Australia show a clear regional alignment. These aren't just training events. They're public signals that China's neighbors are willing to coordinate militarily to resist coercion. That kind of unity is key to deterring aggressive moves without triggering conflict. Beyond the drills, the U.S. ensures its forces are ready to respond. The May 2025 Elephant Walk at Kadena Air Base, involving over 50 aircraft, was a show of force that demonstrated speed, scale, and readiness to operate in a contested environment. It reminded both allies and rivals that U.S. power projection in the Indo-Pacific remains strong and flexible. Diplomatically, the U.S. continues to engage in forums and trilateral talks to promote rules-based order. By working through ASEAN, the Quad, and other platforms, Washington pushes for peaceful dispute resolutions and adherence to international law, particularly the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, UNCLOS, even though the U.S. itself hasn't ratified it. All of these actions are part of a broader power politics play, maintaining influence, supporting allies, and preventing China from unilaterally changing the status quo. It's about shaping the rules of the region, not just reacting to violations. And it reflects how modern power politics involves more than just conflicts. It's about shaping perceptions, building coalitions, and reinforcing legal norms with credible force. Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel are each navigating the Middle East's power dynamics with very different playbooks, all aiming to secure influence, resources, and strategic depth. Iran uses a shadow network of proxy forces to assert control without putting boots on the ground. Hezbollah in Lebanon, armed groups in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen all serve as Tehran's regional levers. This kind of indirect engagement lets Iran steer conflict, pressure rivals, and shape local politics while officially denying involvement. It's cheaper than full-scale war, and harder to retaliate against. Iran's economic strategy also centers on oil and gas. Despite sanctions, it continues to find buyers and partners, particularly in Asia, using energy exports to fund its regional ambitions and maintain ties with sympathetic regimes. Saudi Arabia, in contrast, plays a more conventional statecraft game. It's the leader of a Gulf bloc that counters Iran through formal alliances and regional coalitions. In Yemen, it's led a years-long campaign against the Iranian-backed Houthis to defend its southern border and preserve influence in the Arabian Peninsula. Its partnerships with the UAE, Egypt, and increasingly with Israel show how Saudi Arabia is trying to cement a counter-Iran front. Economically, Riyadh uses oil not just as income, but as leverage. OPEC Plus decisions on oil supply, often coordinated with Russia, give Saudi Arabia a major role in shaping global energy prices and securing strategic favors. Israel focuses on tech, intelligence, and surgical military power. It doesn't rely on proxies or coalitions as much as it does on its unmatched intelligence network and precision strikes. Its airstrikes in Syria target Iranian weapons transfers, while cyber capabilities give it an edge in digital warfare. Israel also counts on its relationship with the United States for military aid, diplomatic backing, and defense cooperation. And recently, it's built stronger ties with Gulf countries like the UAE and Bahrain through the Abraham Accords, reshaping regional alliances. These three powers are all competing for control, influence, and survival in a consistently shifting landscape. Their approaches reflect their strengths, whether it's Iran's asymmetric tactics, Saudi Arabia's wealth and diplomacy, or Israel's tech-driven military edge. And as new developments unfold, from shifting U.S. policy to rising Chinese involvement, each of them is recalibrating how to keep or gain ground in one of the world's most volatile regions. Recent escalations between Israel and the Houthis is a textbook example of power politics playing out in real time. Both sides are using military force not just for defense or retaliation, but to make a statement about influence, deterrence, and dominance in the region. The Houthis, supported by Iran, are no longer just a domestic force in Yemen. Launching a long-range drone strike on Tel Aviv shows they're trying to elevate their role as a regional actor and demonstrate capability far beyond their borders. That drone strike wasn't just an act of war. It was a calculated move to disrupt the balance of power, show solidarity with Iran and its axis of resistance, and test Israel's defenses. By hitting a major Israeli city, they're sending a message that they're part of the broader geopolitical fight, not just the war in Yemen. Israel's counterattack wasn't just about taking out missile depots. It was about projecting strength and restoring deterrence. Operation Outstretched Arm was designed to show that Israel is willing and able to strike beyond its immediate neighborhood if it feels threatened. It's also a signal to Iran and any proxy actors that attacks on Israeli soil will trigger overwhelming retaliation, even across international borders. What makes this a clear case of power politics is how the conflict isn't just about Israel versus the Houthis. It's about Israel versus Iran, Saudi Arabia versus Iran, and the shifting alliances in the Middle East. The Houthis are acting on behalf of a broader Iranian strategy to project influence through non-state actors. Israel is responding as part of a strategic calculus to maintain military superiority and signal deterrence to all its adversaries, not just the one directly involved. This back and forth also disrupts shipping routes in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, so it's not just a military tit for tat. It's affecting global trade, oil flows, and U.S. strategic planning in the region. The conflict isn't isolated. It's part of a much larger chessboard where force, alliances, and strategic messaging are being used to shape the future of the Middle East, and that's power politics at work. The US and Russia are still deeply entrenched in Middle East power politics, each using different levers to maintain influence and respond to shifting dynamics. The US under Trump's current presidency has shifted gears towards economic deals and strategic diplomacy. One of the biggest surprises was Trump's announcement to lift sanctions on Syria after a change in its leadership, a major shift in US posture. That move wasn't just about Syria. It's a way for the US to reassert itself in a part of the region where Russian and Iranian influence has grown. Trump also secured a massive $300 billion investment deal with Saudi Arabia, which reinforces Washington's economic ties with the Gulf and aims to anchor regional stability through trade and defensive deals. Trump's broader strategy includes encouraging more Arab-Israeli normalization, essentially trying to stitch together a pro-US coalition in the region. But the ongoing Gaza war has made that difficult. Saudi Arabia has hesitated to move forward with formal recognition of Israel without serious progress on Palestinian statehood, showing how regional tensions continue to complicate American ambitions. Russia, meanwhile, sticks to its strengths: military presence and reliable alliances. Its role in Syria remains central to its Middle East strategy. By propping up Assad during the civil war, Russia locked in a long-term military and political foothold. It has also deepened defense partnerships through arms sales and joint military training with regional governments. Moscow doesn't need to compete economically with Washington. It's focused on showing it can offer security and regime survival to its allies. Iran operates differently. Rather than relying on direct military power or diplomacy, it expands its reach through proxy groups. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, and forces in Syria and Yemen give Iran regional depth without exposing it to full-scale war. This low-cost, high-impact strategy is designed to pressure Israel, challenge U.S. interests, and keep Iran central in any future regional order. Adding to the complexity is the rise of a multipolar Middle East. Countries like China are expanding their footprint, not through bases or troops, but through infrastructure deals, tech investments, and diplomatic initiatives. Many Middle Eastern governments are now hedging their bets. Instead of choosing between Washington and Moscow, or Tehran, they're building relationships with all three, and with Beijing too. This multi-alignment trend makes the region's power politics more competitive and unpredictable. These overlapping agendas and rivalries mean the Middle East is no longer a playground dominated by one or two global powers. It's a shifting arena where economic deals, military alliances, proxy conflicts, and diplomatic maneuvering all collide in real time. Power politics isn't just alive, it's evolving fast. This synthesis captures the core tension within U.S. foreign policy today: the balance between strategic restraint and global leadership. The U.S. has been deeply involved in supporting Ukraine, but that involvement has always stopped short of direct confrontation with Russia, a deliberate choice designed to avoid escalating into a NATO-Russia war. That line between deterrence and de-escalation continues to define Washington's behavior on the international stage. The proposed 30-day ceasefire in March 2025 reflects both realism and constraint. On one hand, it signals U.S. willingness to find diplomatic off-ramp amid a prolonged war. On the other, trying to renewed military and intelligence aid to progress in negotiations signals that American support is not unconditional, especially as domestic political pressures rise and allied unity becomes harder to maintain. Russia's non-response exposes the limitations of such diplomacy when leveraged without overwhelming coercive pressure. In Syria, the U.S. decision to lift sanctions under a new regime presents both opportunity and risk. Washington is attempting to reshape the Syrian landscape, perhaps hoping to peel Damascus away from Tehran and Moscow. But the consequences are unclear. Empowering Syria's new leadership may shift regional alignments or inadvertently open the door to further Russian re-entrenchment, especially if Moscow views the Middle East as a fallback arena while its power in Ukraine stalls. The fragmentation of consensus among European allies is an especially important development. In the early phases of the war, NATO and the EU presented a unified front, but as the conflict drags on, some nations are pressing for a more aggressive stance, while others, especially those with significant energy or economic ties to Russia, favor negotiations and de-escalation. This divergence threatens transatlantic solidarity at a critical moment. Overall, the U.S. strategy in Ukraine and Syria reflects a complex balancing act, staying engaged without becoming entangled, projecting power without provoking a wider war, and maintaining alliances without forcing uniformity. It's a cautious, calculated, and sometimes controversial approach that will likely define Biden's legacy and pose new tests for Trump's second term. Whether this tightrope walk will preserve U.S. leadership or expose its limits is a question still playing out on the global stage. The war in Ukraine has stripped away much of the idealism that shaped post-Cold War foreign policy and forced a reckoning with realities of power politics in a multipolar world. The Western consensus that emerged after 1991 centered on a liberal international order, the sanctity of sovereign borders, and the spread of democratic norms, has met a stubborn and brutal resistance in the form of Russia's revanchist behavior. What was once considered a relic of the 20th century, spheres of influence, has not only reemerged, but is being violently defended. For Russia, Ukraine is not just a neighboring country. It represents a linchpin in Moscow's strategic buffer zone and a front line in its struggle against what it perceives as Western encroachment. The invasion is not simply about territorial expansion. It's about redrawing geopolitical boundaries and restoring influence over a region it sees as vital to its national identity and security. From the U.S. side, the conflict has shown both the strengths and the limits of deterrence. Billions in aid and sustained diplomatic pressure have helped Ukraine avoid collapse and regain territory. But the refusal to engage militarily, rooted in fears of escalation, has shown how deterrence against a nuclear-armed revisionist power is a fragile and slow-moving strategy. Russia has absorbed massive economic and military losses, yet it remains committed, which raises serious questions about how long the West can sustain support, especially with political divisions at home and fatigue among allies abroad. This has exposed cracks within NATO. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states push for maximalist support and faster, more decisive action, while others, including Germany and France at times, have leaned into caution and diplomacy. These divisions don't spell collapse, but do highlight the difficulty of maintaining unity under the pressure of prolonged crisis. More broadly, the war has challenged the belief that economic interdependence alone can prevent conflict. Russia was deeply enmeshed in the European energy market, yet this did not deter war. It arguably enabled it. The strategic lesson for the US and its allies is that diplomacy, alliances, and economic tools matter, but they are not foolproof shields against power-driven aggression. Going forward, the conflict will shape how the West engages with other revisionist powers, particularly China. It also demands a clearer understanding of where red lines are drawn and what the cost of ambiguity might be. It's not just about defending Ukraine. It's about defending the credibility of the rules-based order in an age where power is once again being defined by who is willing to act and at what cost. If anything, the war in Ukraine has made clear that great power competition isn't just a policy buzzword. It's the defining structure of our era, and managing it will require more than rhetoric. It will require sustained coordination, a more honest assessment of risks, and an evolved strategy that blends principled commitment with strategic realism. In Part 4, we'll close this series by reflecting on what these modern flashpoints can teach us about the enduring nature of power politics. From Ukraine's resistance to the West's cautious assertiveness, we'll ask, what lessons have world leaders learned about deterrence, escalation, and alliance cohesion? What does the failure to prevent war in Europe say about the state of diplomacy? And as new technologies, environmental crisis, and non-state actors continue to shift the terrain, we will consider the future of power politics itself. Is the world heading toward a new multipolar order? Or are we simply seeing old patterns repackaged in new forms? In our final installment, we'll explore the possibilities and the risks that lie ahead.